Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you guys doing? And welcome to the second session of the intellectual seerah. And what we're going to be trying to do in these sessions is we're trying to employ what is referred to as the multidisciplinary approach, an interdisciplinary approach. We're not just dealing with one thing, we're dealing with many different things. We're trying to bring the philosophical discussions or historical discussions, manuscript discussions, psychological discussions, sociological discussions, and of course the Islamic science discussion as well, trying to kind of merge them all together, because quite frankly this is the only way in the modern age we can try and create an original seerah. I mean, seerahs have been taught for 1,400 years now. They've been taught and in many different ways, and we have to use what is to our disposal or at our disposal in order to try and create something quite novel. Why? Number one, because this is what knowledge production is all about. If you want to say something new or bring something new, then you have to try and bring all the information that you have of the day. Number two is because that creates a level of relevance, makes it relevant to the people in the 21st century. So usually what we do, what we would be doing here, is talking about what is referred to, or what are referred to as the shama'il of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or really the characteristics of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there are two kinds of characteristics. There's what is referred to as as-sifat al-khulqiyya or al-khilqiyya, and then al-khuluqiyya, which is you could say the natural characteristics of his actual physical self, and then you have his actual, you could say, etiquettes or his virtues. So we're going to be going through two different things, but of course before we do that we're going to start in a typical manner and deal with the question of beauty itself. Now, why is this question important? It's important because if we're talking about the fact that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has beauty both in character and in physical appearance, then it makes sense to ask the question, is beauty a thing? Of course, many of you may have heard the phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But is this something which is true? Actually, there was a raging discussion in the 18th century between some of the philosophers about this very question, and two people in particular stand out who represent what is referred to as the sentimentalist school or the subjectivist school, and that is David Hume and Immanuel Kant. Now, these two individuals basically belong to a camp called the subjectivist camp. They said that beauty is not a thing out there that you can measure, and therefore it's not objective in that sense. And we are imposing our own sense of kind of aesthetic taste or value judgment onto the object rather than the opposite. But this was not always the belief system. So for example, historically, Aristotle and Plato believed that beauty was a thing objectively measured. So beauty or aesthetics is sometimes analogized with morality, and sometimes it's analogized with mathematics. And what Aristotle said is that, look, I mean, there are some aspects of beauty which can be measured, proportionality, geometric design, symmetry, and so on. And you'll find that this has cross-cultural application. We'll go through that in a second. But this debate between objectivists and subjectivists is important, because if we say that we believe that, for example, that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is beautiful in both character and physical appearance, is this a claim which is a subjective claim? Because if it is, then it's a very difficult claim to make. Use it as proof of the veracity of Islam. If the whole thing is relative and subjective, then how can it be used as proof for the veracity of Islam? Whereas if we can say that at least it maintains a degree of objectivity, then it can actually be used as an evidence for the veracity of Islam. And this is important because the Quran says, لَمْ يَكُنْ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا مِنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ وَالْمُشْرِكِينَ مُنْفَكِّينَ حَتَّى تَأْتِيَهُمُ الْبَيِّنَةُ رَسُولٌ مِنَ اللَّهِ يَتْلُو صُحُفًا مُطَهَّرَةً. That the people of the book were differing until the bayyinah came, the evidence. And the evidence is Rasul min Allah. Actually, he's the evidence himself. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is an evidence in chapter 98 of the Quran for the veracity of Islam. That's something which the Quran hints to and indicates to. So let's get started with it. So we said here that, yes, I mean, look, Plato and Aristotle and Hellenistic kind of philosophers, they would point to things like mathematical forms, and they would say that these mathematical forms are indication that beauty could, at least to some extent, be measured. And this actual idea, it persisted in the Western philosophical tradition to the Renaissance, and obviously people like Michelangelo and others, you know, they believed in that. They believed that beauty was something you can kind of measure, and it's something that's quantifiable. But as I mentioned, that changed with Locke, Kant, and Hume. who all belong to the subjectivist camp. And David Hume says very clearly, beauty exists merely in the mind. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. You've heard that expression before. Nowadays, we're actually finding new evidence, a new layer of evidence after this philosophical discussion, which indicates to the cross-cultural relevance of beauty. Now, it's not the case that everything that is cross-cultural, that exists in many cultures independently, historically and contemporaneously, is true as an objective value, but it's more information, or it's more indication that it may be, right? So, for example, there was one particular study, there are actually many studies to this effect. I've quoted only one here just because of brevity and conciseness, which is the idea of symmetry as beauty enjoys cross-cultural support. So this Bode and Hilmi, a cross-cultural comparison for preferences of symmetry. When we say cross-cultural, we're talking, if you go to this culture and this culture and this culture and that culture, then most cultures would show you, okay, that something which is symmetrical, something which enjoys that level of symmetry, proportionality, is conceived as beautiful by the end user. And that's why you'll find in most things most products or most designs which capture the most attention, they're actually symmetrical. So like we're talking about architecture, for example, some of the architectural designs which are most prominent are geometrically symmetrical. For example, mentioned the Andalusian, if you look at the Islamic, it was referred to as Islamic architecture. But even Gothic architecture, even brutalist, maybe not to the same extent, because it's actually brutalism, we were talking about it before, is the reason why it's like that is because functionality had been emphasized rather than aesthetics. Because of this view, think about it, the 18th and 19th century, people saying beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Well, let's focus on, in fact, not beauty, but let's focus on function. So they give us a building in the United Kingdom, which is meant to be a first world country, which looks quite horrendous comparative to what people were actually able to produce in this country hundreds of years ago. Go to Westminster Abbey, like for example, and just think, use your own sense of taste, look at the architecture there, and then compare it with one of the council blocks or whatever, and see the difference there. It's like there is a degeneration in our conceptions of beauty, and it's actually due to this, if you like, almost postmodernist idea that everything is subjective, there's no level of beauty and this kind of thing. So they're destroying the landscape, not just morality. And so, in many ways, and we'll come to this, and you'll see this when we talk about virtue ethics, and it's very important as well. In many ways, the West has actually gone down in many ways. It's gone up in technology and science, there's no doubt about that, but when it comes to conceptions of beauty and morality, you can see a degeneration in that because of some of the belief systems that have come about, which are of an atheistic kind. But humans have a sense of aesthetic taste. And this, by the way, is categorized in different ways. Like, for example, people watch sports now, for example. People watch football. People watch, like, soccer, I mean, if you're watching this in America, yeah? People watch, like an NBA or whatever it may be. And if you look at, for example, one of the top guys playing in that industry, Messi, for example, no one can have any controversy about his greatness in that field. There's a sense of beauty that is related to that. Now, if I go and play football myself with my lumbering, uncoordinated self, or somebody who is a complete novice, has never, and if you compare the two kinds of football playing, I mean, you could say that the way Messi plays football is not just functionally better, but it's actually more beautiful. Why? Because we already have an inbuilt sense of aesthetic taste. Look, if you get the extremities of the situation becomes more clear. For instance, if I were to put something very vile to be eaten, like, I'm not going to mention anything, but think of the vilest thing that no one would eat, the most unedible thing in the world. Foul stench, but it's still edible in the sense that give you nutritional value, and I give you a fantastic dish, let's say a curry, or I don't know what it may be, like whatever your favorite dish is, chicken or this or that, whatever. Most people in the world would say this is objectively better than this in taste. This objectively, I don't care what anyone says, objectively this is actually better to eat than this in terms of taste. So we all have that sense of, and if this wasn't the case, then why are not supermarkets and restaurants just put anything on there? Because there's a sense of collective understanding of taste which we all respect. Now, this becomes more controversial when we start talking about human beings. Because we say, okay, well, look, that's all well and good, but you're going to apply the same thing to human beings. We would say we have to apply the same thing to human beings. Now, let me give you an example. With all due respect, I'm not saying every human being, الذي خلقك فسواك فعدلك في أي صورة ما شاء ركبك. Allah, He says, لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. We have created the human being in the best of proportions. So from one perspective, human being is created in the best of proportions. All human beings. But from another perspective, there's clearly a differentiation in what we perceive, but what could also be said to be beauty or lack thereof. So for example, if you get somebody and completely deform them, if you deform them, like you take away the eye and this and that and burn them, or if you burn somebody, you cannot tell me that objectively they look better than they used to. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. No, it's not like that. Because if you take that to all cultures of the world, they'll say this one looks objectively better. If you get someone and pour acid in their face and say, is there an objective difference? And most people will say yes. The subjectivist camp will say, no, you're just imposing whatever because of this and that, whatever. There is a degree of subjectivity. I'm not saying there's no degree of subjectivity, but to argue that everything is subjective, it would run counter to everything we know as human beings. So there's a degree of interpretive. I'm not saying that the interpretive, sentimental thing, which is based on our upbringing, based on psychology or our parents or what we consider, or homogamy. For example, there's we've all heard of hypergamy. Nowadays it's become a very famous thing that women, for example, marry across and up dominance hierarchies. But we don't talk about homogamy, which is the idea that women also marry, just like men do, for the most part, people from their own race, from their own ethnicity. That is actually the common trend. A black woman is likely to find a black man attractive, more so than a white man, in fact. Now, is that because of it's just the way it is? I mean, that's what the data says. So maybe her idea of beauty is a little bit different because her upbringing is different. It's more similar to herself. It's more familiarity and stuff like that. A white woman is more likely to see a white man is attractive. By and large, of course, there's exceptions. Otherwise, you wouldn't have mixed race people. You wouldn't have people from different. Of course, there are exceptions. But I'm saying that homogamy is also a thing. But how is homogamy explicable? It's only explicable for the fact that your own set of conditions and psychological background has contributed to you preferring one set of beauties as more or less important than another set of beauties. So there's a degree of subjectivity, but then once again, you cannot render the whole thing subjective, because if you do, you wouldn't be able to explain many of the things. Having said this now, there are also hedonistic conceptions. So like, for example, John Locke and others, but many of the hedonists would say a hedonistic conception of beauty is like something is beauty if it causes you pleasure. Simple as that. If it causes you pleasure, then it's beautiful. If it doesn't cause you pleasure, it's not beautiful. There's no evidence for that, effectively. You can just say that is an effect of beauty, that it causes you pleasure, but it's not, by and large, the only parameter. And in fact, David Hume, he describes what's referred to as, I think it's disinterested pleasure. Well, basically, you got to think about functionality, because, for example, this pen, okay? I don't know, what is the function of a pen? To write. Something which doesn't fulfill its function is not, many people would say, is not beautiful because it doesn't do what it's meant to do. Many people would say, like, and we can go to Aquinas even, interestingly enough. He had this whole thing about the integrity of something, the dignity of something, and the clarity of something. He had a tripartite information of a distinction of what creates something which is beautiful. That has to have integrity, and integrity means wholeness. For something to be integrous, it has to be whole. And the function, the clarity of something, and the clarity of something, I think the function of something as well. So the thing is, this is really, if you go back, it probably goes back to the Platonic forms. Like Plato, he believed that you had this world of forms, literally, where everything has this like archetypal value in this world of forms. And what makes a pen a pen? What makes a knife a knife? At what point does a knife become a sword? Think about that. I mean, like, if I say this is the best knife in the world, and I bring you a sword, effectively, say this is not called a knife, this is called a sword. So at what point does it become a sword, and what point is it a knife? When the functionality may differ. At what point is it a pen, and at what point is it just a cylindrical object, when the functionality is different? So in order for something to be beautiful, most people would say it has to fulfill a certain level of functionality. That's why Darwin was very, very upset about the peacock, because he couldn't explain why it has all these feathers and all those kind of things. And then it led him to the theory of sexual selection. because the peacock has all these colors and stuff like that, and it's a way to try and attract the mate for the mating process. So you have to try and create something called the theory of sexual selection. But having said this, I mean, the point is that function, it features quite heavily. Hume said, well, actually, something which is most beautiful is that which doesn't attempt to be functional in that regard.